Magic the Gathering's next standard set, Wilds of Eldraine, comes out just around the corner, and there's a lot of exciting brand new cards that are being added to the game. In this video, I want to break down the top 10 most expensive cards from the main set, and talk about why they're so expensive and why they're so good. Alright, starting off at number 10, we have Virtue of Loyalty, which is currently going for only $6.99. This is a 5-cost white enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, then untap those creatures. However, this card's also an adventure, so you can play Ardenvale Fealty for 1 and a white and create a 2/2 white knight creature token with Vigilance. This thing gets you a creature early on, and then later in the game makes your board get really big and essentially gives all of your creatures Vigilance. It is a very powerful card. For just 5 mana, you get to grow your board every turn, use tap abilities twice, and overall seems pretty good. Now, it's only going for $7, and some of the later cards are going for a lot more, but it still seems like a really great piece that a lot of decks are going to want, especially if you care about having a lot of creatures, which white typically does. A lot of times in token-based decks, you kind of have to have a good balance of cards that create tokens and cards that care about tokens or boost your tokens, and this allows you to do both, which makes it really valuable as it can go in either slot. Next up, we have Blossoming Tortoise, which is currently going for $6.99 as well. It's a 4-cost green creature, and it says when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to mill 3 cards, then return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Then activated abilities of lands you control cost 1 less to activate, and then land creatures you control get +1/+1. Those are 3 pretty powerful abilities, but they all kind of go in different directions. You want to have land creatures, but you also want to have lands with abilities, but you also want your lands in the graveyard. Now, obviously, this is really good with the man lands, or the lands that turn into creatures, because it makes it less mana to actually turn them into a creature. It makes them bigger creatures, and then if they happen to die in combat, you can just resurrect it with the Blossoming Tortoise. So it's very clearly pointed at that, especially since there's 5 of them in Wilds of Eldraine. But these can just be generically good in any deck that has a decent number of utility lands. I mean, fetch lands can be resurrected to keep getting you more lands, Horizon lands can be sacked to draw you cards, and it actually costs less mana to do so because of the ability. If you happen to run things like Nissa that makes creature lands in other ways, those will also be bigger. The best thing about it is the attack trigger. Even if you don't have any lands in your graveyard, about 1 in 3 cards in your deck should be lands, so when it attacks, you'll mill 3, and then most of the time, you'll be able to resurrect a land. It just means that every time you attack, you get to ramp. When it ETBs, you get to ramp. It's a creature. It kind of can, happen to get you a little bit of value later. It just seems really good for just 4 mana. Next up, we have Virtue of Strength, which is currently going for $7.99, and it's another one of the Virtue cycle. This one's a 7-cost green enchantment that says if you tap a basic land for mana, it produces 3 times that much mana instead. And then it's also an adventure that lets you pay a green to return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. It reminds me a lot of Nyx Bloom Ancient with the tripling mana, but it only does it for basic land sources. So if you have a lot of dual lands or a lot of, mana rocks or things that aren't lands, you're not going to be able to triple the mana from that. So it definitely isn't as powerful. The one big advantage, though, is the fact that it's an adventure. If you draw this early in the game, you can still cast the adventure side to return a creature or land from your graveyard to your hand. It kind of makes it a 1-mana cantrip where you're able to at least replace it in your hand, and then because of how adventures work, you can still cast it later. Because of that, it doesn't put a lot of strain on your deck to put it in there. As long as you have a decent number of creatures or fetch lands or, things that can go in the graveyard, at its worst, this is a card that you cycle away, but then still get to cast later. And I think it's really easy to include in decks, especially if you're in 2 or less colors. So I think this is a really good card. At first I thought it was amazing, and then I realized it was basic lands and I thought it was terrible, and now looking back at it, because that adventure is only 1 green mana and it replaces itself in your hand, this is almost a free include in a lot of decks. So I think it's actually really, really good. Next up, number 7, we have Eriette of the Charmed Apple, also going for $7.99. This is 1 a white and a black for a legendary creature, human warlock, 2/4, and it says each creature that's enchanted by an aura you control can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. Then at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of auras you control. This is a very good commander. It's a commander that wants you to enchant your opponent's stuff to keep you safe. It's kind of a pillow fort in that way. It is a little dangerous, and I did a whole YouTube short breaking this down where you do have to have protection, because if you're boosting up your opponent's creatures and then Eriette dies, those are going to come at you, and so you really have to be careful and run a lot of protection spells in the deck. But I think it's a really, really fun commander, and that is why it's higher up on the list, is because people are going to want to run it for that reason. Commander is the most popular format, and so typically the legendary creatures in a set go up in price just for being legendary, and this is one that has a fairly unique effect that I think a lot of people are excited for, and so that's why it's, in the top 10 list. Although $8 isn't necessarily expensive, we'll see that, cards are going to ramp up in price here fairly quickly. But yeah, it drains your opponents naturally, meaning you don't have to attack. It kind of stalls out the game. It is a very, very good commander, and so I'm excited to see the deck list, and I think a lot of people are excited to see the card. Next up, number 6, another commander, Will, Scion of Peace. He is currently going for $7.99, and he's a 3-cost white and blue legendary creature with vigilance that lets you tap him, and it says spells you cast this turn that are white and or blue cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you've gained this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This is a really powerful ability because it means that you can cast multiple spells for really cheap. In a way, Will is kind of just ramp, but the fact that it applies to all spells you cast and not the next one means if you gain something like 3 life, which is really easy to do with like a food token or, a life gain spell, all of your spells cost 3 less to cast, and it gets you a lot of consistent value. As opposed to Rowan, who's all about this one, big turn because it cares about damage you've taken, Will can just get you consistent value every turn and make your spells really, really cheap to cast, and you can cast a lot of them. This is going to be a very popular commander from the set, and that's part of the reason it is higher up on this list. Next up, number 5 is Ashiok, Wicked Manipulator. It's currently going for $9.99, and it's the only planeswalker in the set, but it's a 5-cost black planeswalker that enters with 5 loyalty, and it says if you would pay life while your library has at least that many cards in it, exile that many cards from the top of your library instead. Then you can +1 to look at the top 2 cards of your library and exile one of them and put the other one into your hand. You can -2 to create 2 1/1 black nightmare creature tokens with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if a card was put into exile this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And -7, target player exiles the top X cards of their library, where X is the total mana value of cards you own in exile. This is obviously a card that cares about cards being in exile, but that passive ability really leans you towards wanting to have effects that pay life. Things like Bolas's Citadel and Necropotence are both really awesome cards with this card, and it's a really unique planeswalker. Going forward, they're planning on only having 1 planeswalker per set, and they said part of that is that it lets them put more focus on the singular planeswalker, and I think Ashiok is really showing you how a single planeswalker can be really cool. This seems like one of the coolest planeswalkers we've gotten in quite some time. It has a really interesting passive. The +1 is going to draw you some cards, put stuff in exile, which kind of fits into the same theme. You get to create creatures that get bigger as long as you're doing that theme, and then an ultimate that'll probably win you the game. I think planeswalkers with passives are really interesting, and they lead to unique designs, and I think Ashiok definitely falls into that camp. I don't know if it'll hold at $10. I don't know if it's really that powerful of a card or if it's just novelty, but I think this card has a home in a lot of different places, and I could definitely see it going up in price, although I at least in the short term see it going down. Next up, number 4, we have Virtue of Knowledge. It's a 5-cost blue enchantment that says if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. This is the Elesh Norn or Yarick or Panharmonicon effect that is really, really powerful, but it's also part of the Virtue cycle, so it's also an adventure that's 1 in a blue to copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. This is the best of the Virtue series for a couple reasons. First, the adventure is really, really powerful, allowing you to copy things like fetch land targets, planeswalker abilities, just any kind of activated or triggered ability, and it does so at a rate that's pretty comparable to other cards. But then once you copy that ability, you then also get the option to cast Virtue of Knowledge later, which on its own is also similarly costed to Elesh Norn and Yarick, and just 1 more than Panharmonicon, but it triggers for all permanents, not just artifacts and creatures. Both halves of these are really competitively costed, and they're both really good and are going to be wanted in a lot of decks. This is one of those cards that you might want to pick up now or, shortly after release, because it's one of those cards that I think in the long term will be pretty expensive and hard to reprint since it does have an adventure on it. It means it can't just be thrown into a set like some other reprints. This has to be in a set with adventures or in a master set, or something where adventure can just be a one-off in that set. So this is one of those cards that I think in the long run will really spike in price, because if your commander or your deck cares about things entering, which a lot of them do, this is going to be great in the deck. Next up, number 3 is Agatha Soul Cauldron. It's currently going for $14.99, and it's a 2-cost legendary artifact with 3 pretty big abilities. First one, you may spend mana as though it were a mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control. Then, creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Then tap, exile target card from a graveyard. When a creature card is exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Starting off, this just does a lot for 2 mana. It's graveyard hate for your opponents, allowing you to exile anything from their graveyard. It gets to put counters on your creatures when you happen to exile creatures, similar to a Scavenging Ooze. It then gives your creatures the abilities of those exiled things, whether they're your opponent's creatures or just creatures you exiled from your graveyard. It also combos with a lot of things, and it makes, activated abilities really easy to activate. So if you, steal something from your opponent that requires black mana, but you're not in a black deck, you can still activate that. But even things like, a Kenrith deck may want to put this card in there just because it makes all of his abilities just like generic mana. Overall, this card just does a lot that a lot of decks are looking for just 2 mana. It really easily combos. It can give a really busted ability to all of your creatures if you happen to discard something with a great activated ability. It just does a lot for very little cost, and so because of that, it can go in, any deck in Commander. It can go in a lot of decks and just get value, even as just a standard graveyard hate piece. So it's just gonna see a lot of play because it just does a lot of things that a lot of decks are looking for. Next up, number 2, we have a very spicy card, that being Moonshaker Cavalry, currently going for $17.99. This is white Craterhoof Behemoth in almost every way. It's 5 white for a 6/6 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is now the best finisher in white if you have a lot of creatures. Giving all your creatures +5/+5 even, or, in a lot of cases +7/+7, and flying is going to win you the game a lot of the time, in the same way that Craterhoof Behemoth's +X/+X and trample will also win you the game. It's kind of crazy because white has been a color that cares about going wide for so long, but it typically just doesn't have a lot of the good game enders that green does, like Triumph of the Hordes and Craterhoof Behemoth, and now it has its own Craterhoof Behemoth. It also means that green-white decks now have 2 Craterhoof Behemoths, which is really insane as well. Overall, this card's only going for $18 now. I expect it'll, shift up slightly. Craterhoof normally sits around, $30, and this, in a lot of cases, is going to be better because it's the only option white has, where green can run other things like Triumph of the Hordes, Finale of Devastation, those kind of effects. This is going to be the best white finisher in the game. And finally, the number 1 most expensive card in Wilds of Eldraine, it is Beseech the Mirror, currently going for $39.99. It's a 4-cost black sorcery with bargain. It says, search your library for a card and exile it face down, then shuffle. If the spell was bargained, you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if that spell's mana value is 4 or less. Put the exiled card into your hand if it wasn't cast this way. So if you don't have an artifact, enchantment, or token to sack to the bargain, this is just a 4-cost tutor that lets you go get any card from your deck, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But if you have an enchantment, artifact, or token, and you sack it when you cast it, you get to put that thing straight on the battlefield if it's mana value 4 or less. Why this is so powerful is that it's essentially copies 5 through 8 of any 4 or less drop in your deck. This is an extra The One Ring, Orcish Bowmaster, as well as Shieldred in all of the formats where those are dominating. It allows you to be extra consistent in decks that are already really consistent, and I think it's going to just be a powerhouse in most formats, especially older formats where things with mana value 4 or less really run the format. This card is just really crazy in those competitive formats, and so it's going for $39.99. Alrighty guys, those were the top 10 most expensive cards from Wilds of Eldraine. It was a little bit lower than recent standard sets, but I do want to note this does have Enchanting Tales, which also bring up the value of packs with a couple really expensive cards. And if you want to learn about the top 10 most expensive cards that are in that Enchanting Tale slot, it'll be on the end screen here once it's released. Otherwise, you can check out this video here where I break down the mechanics of the set, or this video here where I break down what exactly is in a collector booster. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.